Hi, I'm Robert,
And I'm Evelyn.
and this is Talking About It Special Edition number 1.
Yes, we're doing a series of bonus episodes, our very first series of bonus episodes on a specific topic, which is going to be Beowulf!
Who?
Beowulf! All right, guys. So we're going to talk about Beowulf and Tolkien, and there's a lot about this, but a little bit of background first about us in Beowulf. So for me, I read it in high school, and I loved it. I thought it was so cool, but I love anything like Norse and Nord and Old English and Vikings, so it was right up my personal alley.
The only time I ever read this was as a senior in high school, but that was 1979. Don't tell anybody.
First time I read it was high school too, but I've read it several times since
I
then
know,
because I
but
enjoyed it so much.
but we had a much older translation than is available now.
Yes, and I will get into that in a
And
little
also at the time, I'm like, okay, if they have to number the lines of this, I don't want to flip and read it.
But Shakespeare does too, but I'm also a Shakespeare nerd. Anyway, so Beowulf, I was really into Beowulf, and I had no idea Tolkien was as well. I mean, I knew it was kind of one of his inspirations, but I didn't know how much of Beowulf he really liked until one of our listeners actually sent me a picture of the book J.R.R. Tolkien Beowulf and was like, "Have you guys seen this?" And I went, "What?" Also, I've had a lot of caffeine, just spoiler.
What?
Yeah, so I immediately had to get it and read it, and it
By
is
the
by
way,
far.
this is how she usually talks around the house.
This is me fully caffeinated and fully awake and fully enthralled in something that I know. But anyway, um, so I have read the translation from Hal D. Chickinson Jr., which is, oh shoot, I forgot to write the year that was translated, but that's the one I read in high school, and that's the one I've read since. And something that they do that Tolkien doesn't for the Beowulf is the translation was more about the poetry and the words versus for Tolkien it's more about the story.
Right, because one of the things Tolkien criticizes and expresses frustration is that historians and the like did not appreciate Beowulf because it did not give them anything new about the actual history.
Right. Now, we'll get a little bit more into that in Tolkien about Beowulf, but let's go ahead and talk about what is Beowulf. At the very...
Isn't that just a large wolf?
Actually, Beowulf means... This is something really cool. Beowulf means Beowulf, which is another term for bear, because in Norse culture, they were afraid to say bear because if they said the name of animals, they would appear. So it was actually called bee hunter, which is bear.
Bee hunter?
Bee hunter, like they hunt honey and bees.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
I thought you were still talking about the letter B.
Oh, no. But anyway, the bare bones of this story, for those of you that have not read it. So the story starts with this guy named Beowulf who is already a hero in his own right in his own country. He finds out that a friend of the family, a king from another country, is being basically humiliated and tortured by and being traumatized by all those fun words by this monster called Grendel that keeps killing everybody. So Beowulf goes over and is like, "I'll kill him." And they're like, "You lost a swimming race." And they're like, "Oh yeah, I lost a swimming race because I had to slay sea monsters while I was swimming." And they're like, "All right, fight Grendel." So he fights Grendel, rips his arm off, and Grendel goes home and bleeds to death. Grendel's mother gets really upset and comes and kills off a bunch of people as well. And so Beowulf hops into a lake and fights her with a giant sword. And when I say giant sword, I mean literally a sword made by giants, so it was magical. The only thing that could actually kill her. He goes home and he's the ruler for 50 years. There's a big break in the story that has been... We'll talk about it later, but it's basically been lost to history. So 50 years later, this dragon starts terrorizing his country, and so he goes with a group of men to defeat it, and he defeats the dragon but dies in the process, and he's the ultimate Norse hero.
Yay.
At the bare bones of it, it doesn't seem like a very long story, and it's not a very long story, and it seems pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Wrong!
Of course.
So What's actually really cool about Beowulf, and something that Tolkien and I both agree on, is it's one of the few surviving sagas that has come to modern age that gives us these histories that there's not much record of in other places. I mean, it's stuff that we know, but this kind of confirms it. It talks about mead halls. It talks about these heroes. It talks about the mythology of the Norse people. Even though, and we're going to talk about this right now, it was actually written by a Christian monk.
Yeah. Speculation is that it was Saint Bede. That's Bede.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of stuff associated with him. Some think he was the writer of the original Arthur legends. Um, and he may have even been the writer for much other type of poetry and legends, but he wasn't necessarily writing some of those others to be poetry and legend, kind of doing it to set up how great Anglo-Saxon monarchs are because of this history.
Right. This is considered more of a history rather than an actual mythology. And yes, these things are great and profound and magical, but it's based off of real people.
Okay.
However, something that Tolkien talks about that I love is he talks about the fact that it's not just a history. It's a love letter to the pagans and to the Vikings. Because while this is written through a Christian and Catholic lens, and the author puts in a lot of like, to whom the blessed God sent, and all that kind of stuff within the text, he talks about how even though these pagans were pagans and weren't Christian, how they still got some things right about the way that they view the world, where Vikings in themselves, if you look at their mythology, is actually kind of dark and depressing. Like the entire theme of the Norse gods is it's the gods versus monsters, and the gods know they're gonna lose, but they fight anyway, and that's the cool part.
So I want to read a couple of things out of Tolkien's lecture / paper called Beowulf, Monsters and Critics, which I find hilarious because he's putting monsters and critics on the same level.
Oh my god, if you guys read Beowulf and then read this lecture, it is hilarious. He really goes after those critics and is like, y'all dumb, y'all missing the point, listen up.
So I want to read this part first. It is poor in criticism that is directed to the understanding of a poem as a poem. It has been said of Beowulf itself that its weakness lies in placing the unimportant things at the center and the important on the outer edges. This is one of the opinions I wish specifically to consider. Now, that last sentence, this is one of the opinions that I wish specifically to consider, is polite British way of saying, you're wrong and I'm going to show you why.
Exactly. He is the 1920s version of a PowerPoint party, which millennials, you'll get that. But yeah, and so Tolkien really loved Beowulf, and that's what this bonus episode is going to focus on for the rest of that time. So that's what the rest of this bonus episode is going to be about. Is we talked about what Beowulf is, so now we're going to talk about why Tolkien loved it so much. And I have 4 things here.
Okay.
So the first one, obviously, is that it is told through a Catholic? Catholic? Is it Catholic or Catholic? How do you? What am I trying to say here?
Christian. Because at this time, there's only 2 forms of Christian, and they both, and both of them have allegiance to Rome.
Cool. All right, that. So it's for a Christian lens, and like I was saying, it's a history about the pagans as well as a love letter to them. And that was something that he really enjoyed. But we also know Tolkien was very, very Christian, and he thought it was just cool that we had a Viking Norse story written by a Christian where they find stuff that they can both agree with. He just thought that was neat. And then we had the Vikings themselves. Like me, Tolkien was a huge Viking nerd. And didn't you have something about the history about it? Because that's the thing too. It's he loved the history about Beowulf.
Right. So yeah, what I have here again, I'm going to read a passage
Okay.
from Beowulf, Monsters and Critics. Uh, First of all, before I read this, Tolkien expresses frustration that historians and the like did not appreciate Beowulf because they didn't get anything new about actual history, which, as I said earlier.
Right.
So this is what he says. I would express the whole industry in yet another allegory. A man inherited a field in which was accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his father. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends, coming, perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over, with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or discover where the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building materials. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle this is." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones to build a nonsensical tower. What did not he? Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion, but from the top of the tower the man had been able to look out to the sea.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like
I,
that's such a good metaphor.
yeah, I love that because he's so I mean you heard it, but he's
To boil it down, he's like, people forget why it's important in the first place
right,
rather than just deconstructing it. Because again, I remember that from high school. I was talking about this today at work, how they make us read like the worst and most depressing things in public American high school. But Beowulf was one of the few things that was really cool. And our teacher put it in perspective of us from the writing of a saga, which is what got me into the sagas in the first place, as you probably heard from another bonus episode when we talked about the Volsung saga, where it's all about just the epicness of it, which brings me to the next point. This is considered high fantasy, and this is something that Tolkien also loved, was just the high fantasy of it, because in this story, a lot of historians are just like, and a lot of people that read are just like, monsters aren't real, the Vikings were so dumb. This is not about the monsters as monsters. We're gonna get to this in another bonus episode,
right,
but the basic part of it is the monsters is a metaphor for what humans have to go through and the obstacles they must go through to have the good lives that they have. To go back to your metaphor, they have to build the tower to see the sea. Like,
right, yeah,
it's about overcoming things. And that's what he really liked, was that high fantasy where it's like he knew that the writer knew this was a fantasy. And it was just a cool
right,
freaking story.
right, and also at the time, uh, uh, disformed people were considered monsters.
Yes.
And so also at this time, they're starting to get some speculation, some stories, maybe even seen one or two. Uh, like I said, this was written probably between 700 and 750 AD. So these could have been like Ethiopians or some other African tribe that, like carves themselves or
Yeah.
does a thing with their lip or something like that.
And this is their first time interacting with those types of people. And we're not going to get into what that all means. You can kind of get it from yourselves.
But also, this is the time where Muslims were starting to take over Spain. And most Muslims were much darker skinned too. Mm-hmm. And they wore different types of clothes.
But remember, Vikings were also considered monsters to the Anglo-Saxons as well. So, just kind of putting that in perspective, because, like, the whole history of berserkers, like, freaked out the Anglo-Saxons back then. But that brings us to, like, the final point that I had about why Tolkien loved this so much is he was a language nerd, and this was in Old English. And Tolkien, he could read and write Old English very well. He was brilliant at it. He was fluent. That's the word. He was fluent in it. And so in the 1920s, he's reading all of these translations, and he's like, these suck. Because you're only focusing on the words and the poetry. Right. You're trying to make the poetry fit. And while it flows in Old English, you're trying to make it flow in English, and that's not how it works. So instead of writing this as an epic poem, he wrote it in prose. And as someone who just despises poetry, sorry to all you poetry fans out there, if you like poetry, awesome, great. Well, I don't understand it. I don't get it. I can't do it.
Okay, but...
So reading this translation was so much better to me. It made me love Beowulf even more because it was prose.
Right. But, to be fair, he did not write it as prose. He was true to the fact of how it was originally written.
So, I like it because of exactly that. Because he writes it true to the translation and true to what the actual story is, rather than that artistic license. Because while reading it in high school, I did kind of prefer attempting to, like, I remember very specifically trying to figure out how to pronounce the Old English stuff just to see how it flowed, because it was written as a poem, essentially, where they tried to not necessarily make it rhyme, but they tried to make every beat the same as the original.
Right.
Which even I failed at that. I'm so bad at poetry, y'all. Only thing I ever failed in high school besides Spanish. Which is also bad. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of Tolkien and Beowulf. We're gonna get more into the monsters themselves. We're gonna talk more about Grendel and Grendel's mother, more about the dragon, more about the history, more about the inspiration that it had on the Lord of the Rings. Right. But I think that's about it for, like, this particular episode. Or did you have anything else?
I just had a couple of little things. Mm-hmm. So we talked about how much he loved Beowulf, and that was one reason why he undertook.
Yeah. But he did not, I totally forgot to mention this. He did not publish this. This was published by his son, who edited it and published it how do you say that word?
After he died.
Well, how do you say that other word?
I don't know. That's what I'm saying, after he died.
Y'all know what we're trying to say.
Posthumously.
That word.
But I still pronounced it wrong.
I think you pronounced it pretty close, though. Closer than me. But it was just a fun project for him. He's like, I can't stand these other translations, so I'm going to write my own. And then he just kind of forgot about it, because it was just a project for him. It was just for fun. And I think that's what makes it so great as well, is he just did it for fun.
Well, one, academics don't ever do anything for fun. I mean, he might have done it, he might have picked it because he would enjoy it, but he would not have been allowed the time to do that if it wasn't also seen as an academic pursuit by his employers, the college.
That's true. It was part of his lectures about Beowulf, because he did a series of lectures about Beowulf as well. And so
he also, in talking about the Old English, he also did a translation of the story Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Yes.
And
which I want to read as well.
and if you want to see an adaptation, the one that's current, the most current adaptation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is really close to how Tolkien imagined it to be.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Yeah, so any more about Tolkien and what he thought about Beowulf and his relationship to Beowulf? Like I said, we're going to be talking about the monsters and the actual Norse culture in the next episode. This next episode, we're going to be talking about the direct influence into Lord of the Rings, such as the Rowan's culture, and some of the elves, the tree ents, which I thought was really interesting.
Even where he got the name for the orcs.
Yes. So that'll be our next bonus episode. So these will be published theoretically every other week
between the other ones.
Regular episodes, which we're gonna record the next one tomorrow, most likely. In our real time. So this should be out for you guys, and by the time you're listening to this, I really hope you enjoyed this. This is something that we both, I really enjoy it, and I think you've enjoyed it since researching it.
Okay, and I want to add this too. My wife, Evelyn's mother, saw that we were reading this and has picked it up and can't put it down.
Yes, my mom is reading it for the first time, and she's loving it, which I would like to see her read another translation personally and see which one she likes better, because she's a little bit more into like poetry and kind of stuff. So it would be interesting to see what she thinks. And I'm curious what you guys think. If you guys have read the Tolkien adaptation, or if you've read other translations, what's your favorite translation? What do you guys think about it?
Or what do you not like about it?
True.
Because most of us, I would say,
read it in high school and hated it.
read it in high school, and we were asked to take it apart.
Yes.
And the teachers, when they do that, completely forget the nature of the thing that we are reading and studying, and nitpicking it and making us as teenagers try to interpret it.
I mean, I thought it was really cool I think my teacher did a really good job, but she was my favorite teacher because she was one of the few teachers that actually, cared. But, shout out to Miss Lynch. But yeah, a lot of times, that's something that I was talking about at work, and I think that's something that we could talk about real fast, is how, just literature in general and the public school, at least in the American public school system, is really terrible. I mean, American classics that they make you read, like Catcher in the Rye, I will go on record saying that is my most hated book in the world. I despise The Catcher in the Rye.
Mine is The Conspiracy of Dunces, which, interesting enough, is one of Mom's favorites.
Never read that one, but I hate The Great Gatsby, I hate Soylent Green. 1984 I appreciate, but not as a teenager, and etc.
But I think one of the reasons why teachers still want people to read Catcher in the Rye is because the person that murdered John Lennon was doing so because he had read Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, but he was also legit insane.
Yes, but that's the...
So was the person in Catcher in the Rye.
Right.
Soylent Green is people. Okay.
Wrong book.
No, I was just saying that's just another creepy thing that we had to do in high school.
You had to go around and say Soylent Green is people?
We did after we read it. And with that, guys, I guess we'll say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Lovely. I've been Evelyn.
I've been Robert.
And we're talking about it. Or Beowulfing about it?
We're talking about Beowulfing.
Talking about Beowulf. All right. Bye, guys.